With the recent return of Fatigue in Flesh and Blood and the recent World's Top 8 in Finals, the concept of setup and setup turns has really been a major focal point of Flesh and Blood. Setup has always been a really important part of Flesh and Blood at its core. The arsenal has always been really important in Flesh and Blood because it allows you to set up 5-card hands that get to go over the top of your opponent's 4-card blocks. But not just that, there's other heroes that can set up permanents that can roll over into the next turn in order to gain some extra card advantage for the next turn. So maybe you can turn your 5-card hand into a 6-card hand with something like an energy potion, agility, vigor tokens. There's a bunch of ways in Flesh and Blood to punish people for taking setup turns. Discussing how to do that is important for new players because it teaches you how to play the game at an even higher level than just, oh, I look at my hand and I play the way that gives me the most value. I made this list to kind of show what decks are setup decks and what decks aren't setup decks, and then we're going to use this to discuss how you should punish people trying to set up on you, especially if you're playing maybe a more defensive deck. There's kind of 4 different ways that Flesh and Blood decks can exist as it regards to setup. So there's setup heavy decks that block very well, and there's setup heavy decks that don't block very well at all. And then there's setup light decks that don't block well, and setup light decks that block extremely well. So just for example, I think Teklevasin blocks extremely well, but is also often taking setup turns. Basically, the whole game is a setup for them to play Singularity and get in the mech, and their plan is to just win off of that. Another deck that is kind of similar is Vincent, where they're often just straight up taking turns off, getting a card into their banish zone for next turn, while playing cards like Malefic Incantation, so that they can have strong turns and then weak turns. A setup heavy deck that doesn't block at all. Currently, the one that is the most emblematic of this type of deck is Auxilio. Auxilio currently plays a bunch of cards that block 0 and really likes to arsenal specific cards like Gone in a Flash or Blast to Oblivion or the Sigils or other instants that allow them to go over the top and play 7-card hands where they're dealing 40 damage. But even in the more mid-range Auxilio lists, they like to play a bunch of setup turns where they're kind of not doing anything and they can still just draw these hands that like block 6, or maybe the 6 is high. Then the setup light decks that block well, I think Victor is one of the best examples of this, where he just looks at his hand and maybe it has a clash card in it and he blocks with it and then he attacks you with his biggest thing. Or maybe he blocks with the whole hand. If he's ever setting up, it's basically only to put a pummel in Arsenal, because his other cards that you could consider to be setup, like Gold Main Estate, are really just tempo plays because they draw more cards for you to be able to attack with your other cards. A setup light deck that blocks poorly would be Prism, where she is just like attacking you with a bunch of stuff, at least the current version, and maybe she's arsenaling some important cards like Herald of Erudition or the instants that allow you to get around poppers or get around blocks. But overall, like, she's pretty happy to just play value hands and get a little bit of soul and then pop off with her hat. Now that we've talked about the different types of decks in Flesh and Blood, let's discuss some ways that we can try to punish these decks for setting up. For all the heroes that don't block particularly well and also want to try and set up turns, there's a bunch of 2-cost 6 attacks that just punish you for trying to hold a bunch of cards and do some stuff that doesn't really attack. Obviously, Command and Conquer is the one that is the most important. Command and Conquer says that your opponent is no longer allowed to arsenal their important cards if they can't afford to block the Command and Conquer. So Auxilio will arsenal Gone in a Flash and sometimes draw a hand that blocks 3, and then the opponent plays Command and Conquer, and then Auxilio is really sad. But this is also important against decks like Dash.io, where if Dash.io draws a hand with maybe 1 item in it, and then they've arsenaled High Octane or another important card, like maybe System Reset, and the opponent plays Command and Conquer, then Command and Conquer takes the boost cards out of their hand, but now they have to play a 2-card hand with an item and a boost card, and things get really awkward. Some other important ones in the current meta are Erase Face. This one really punishes all the decks that want to fuse or decompose, but it's best against decks that don't really want to block you. Sometimes I see people say that Erase Face is pretty good into the Earth Heroes, but I actually disagree. I think Erase Face is not good into Earth Heroes because they actively want to block with at least 2 cards per turn. They want to make sure they're getting Earth cards in the graveyard, so when you attack with Erase Face, they're getting to do what they wanted to do anyways, which is block with their cards. Another important 2-for-6 is Weakest Link, but this card doesn't actually disrupt setup decks as much as the other 2 cards I just talked about. The Weakest Link disrupts the hand, so if you're trying to disrupt the hand, you're not really fighting their setup turn because the setup is either on board or an arsenal. If they just drew up 4 cards, Weakest Link is good against that. So your attacks that are good against setup are really like Command and Conquer, Erase Face, Amnesia, and the Weakest Link is good against the non-setup decks. If we look at our list, like it's quite good against Prism because Prism often has no blocks in her hand, and she isn't particularly worried about setting up specific cards, so you attack her with Weakest Link, and she looks at her hand and says, I guess I have to block this now because they're going to draw a card and I'll have to discard my no block. It's also quite good against Aurora because Aurora oftentimes draws these hands that have a 0 blocking in them, and then she's forced to either just spend the 0 cost or block with some of her hand in order to keep it. But Aurora isn't particularly setup heavy and Prism aren't particularly setup heavy, so you can punish these low block, low setup decks with the Weakest Link instead. Now these 2-for-6s are particularly bad against the decks that just want to block anyways because they will just block with 2 cards and they got their 3 value out of their each card. There's some other ways to punish those types of decks. If we look at the type of decks in the top right, which is the setup heavy but blocks well, you'll see decks like Viscerai, Vincent, Bolton, those types of decks. And against those types of decks, Warmonger's Diplomacy is extremely good. Viscerai sometimes draws hands that are unplayable under Warmonger's Diplomacy, and Warmonger's Diplomacy stops Vincent from creating rune chance on the turns when she wants to attack. Oftentimes you just play Warmongers, and then the cards that they wanted to block with anyways get blanked, and maybe they IP1 because in a perfect world they would block you with 2 cards and then they would send their attack. So in the case of maybe playing a Humble or an Amnesia or a Command and Conquer or an Erase Face, they would be significantly happier because then they'd be able to use their cards. When you just play Warmonger's Diplomacy, that all goes out the window because they no longer get to interact with it. Another way to try and punish the decks that try to set up is by playing Defense Reaction, so the best one is Sink Below. Sink Below is a card that punishes setup decks if you're a defensive deck. So if you're playing a control deck like maybe Enigma or New, and your opponent is setting up a larger turn, you get to just arsenal your D-React, and then when your opponent tries to play their 5-card hand, well, you have a 5-card blocking hand to back it up. And you get to run 6 copies of Sink Below in your deck because you get to play Sink Below and Fade Foreseen. There's other types of cards that get to do this, and the one that's really on everybody's mind right now is Count Your Blessings. Count Your Blessings really punishes decks that want to block you, because when they attempt to set up their turn and you just gain 6 life, you blanked 2 cards in their hand because they can no longer block, and you punish their setup turn because they didn't attack you last turn, so you got to keep cards. So if we look at our list here, decks like Bolton and Max and Teklevossen all really want to be able to block your Command and Conquer, but if on your turn you just play Count Your Blessings, suddenly their win condition is getting weaker and weaker. Now I want to talk about some important players in the meta and how we can counter them if they're trying to set up, or we can talk about what we can do to them even if they're not trying to set up. So the first deck to talk about is Enigma. Enigma is a deck that will set up turn over turn. They play their auras and attack with them and force you to keep all of your cards in order to try and hit them so that their aura goes away. If your opponent plays a card like Waxing Spectre and attacks for 4 with it, and then on your turn it just blocks for 3, well, they played a 2-card 7. You know, that's good, but it's not insane. But if your opponent plays their Waxing Spectre and attacks for 4 with it, and then they keep it around, and then on their next turn they attack for another 4, well, now it's a 3-card 11, which is significantly stronger, and then you just get more value turn over turn. Enigma wants to block a lot and wants to set up, but how do you punish a deck that wants to block a lot and set up? Well, you need to set up strong turns as well. When they don't set up, you set up, and then when they set up, you have to attack, right? There's a back and forth there. So if your opponent plays a Waxing Spectre, you want to play a 5-card hand, and then if your opponent plays a Command and Conquer, you want to just hold back your cards, and you can afford to block a little bit. That's why I think actually Command and Conquer is a little bit weaker in Enigma than maybe cards like the Weakest Link, because Command and Conquer is attacking the opposing deck in a way that they want to exist already, right? Like if I'm Enigma and I don't have an aura out and I play Command and Conquer, then the opposing hero says, oh, you can't play an aura, I'm fine with blocking this turn. But if Enigma is just playing out their auras, then the opposing hero says, oh, I guess I have to keep all my cards, I'll attack. Now, obviously, Command and Conquer is insane if you play an aura and then attack with it. Let's talk about Aurora. Aurora is a deck that doesn't block great. They play at least 6 instants, or at least 5, because they always have the discharges in their deck, and they always have 2 blue instants in their deck, basically. They don't particularly need to set up in any instance. Unless your opponent shows you that they're playing Crown of Dominion, you can be fairly certain that they're not playing Flicker Wisp, and if they're not playing Flicker Wisp, then they're not really trying to set up any huge turns. The only thing is they're just trying to get like maybe 4 pings out of Arc Lightning. Oftentimes, like, they can play around Command and Conquer, which is something that we saw Mercy Bickle do in the top 8 of Worlds Osaka. She basically never arsenaled unless it was an instant. We saw Command and Conquer get punished by Sigil of Solace in the game against Valentine, and even in a situation where she's playing against Enigma, the deck where you want to keep 5-card hands the most, she said, nope, I'm not going to keep a 5-card hand because I don't want to lose value to Command and Conquer, which I thought was really smart. The way you actually attack this deck then is to attack the hand with Weakest Link or Erase Face. They're going to struggle to be able to block them. They'll have to use armor on the first one, and then maybe the second one they won't be able to block as well. Sometimes you play your Weakest Link and it just doesn't interact with their hand at all, and sometimes you play your Erase Face and it just doesn't interact with their hand at all. You know, sometimes you got to take your lumps like that. You can interact with her, but you don't want to interact in the Command and Conquer way because they can just basically always play around it. They're always going to be getting value out of their cards. This also isn't really a deck that scales exponentially off of its hand, it scales linearly. So oftentimes, if Aurora has 2-3 blocks in their hand, they're very willing to block your 6 attacks, so keep that in mind. The next hero to talk about is Viserai. Viserai often plays cards like Malefic Incantation, and wants to arsenal Mordred Tide really badly, because the more Malefic Incantations you have on the board, the stronger your Mordred Tide is. The deck has a ton of 3 blocks, and its blocking armor is insane. So it is difficult to play cards like Command and Conquer and Erase Face into them, because they just slam their 2-3 blocks. Now, you are getting some value out of that, because now their Mordred Tide hands are a lot worse, but because they're a setup heavy deck, they oftentimes just like play Read the Runes, play Malefic Incantation, and they're totally happy just waiting for a better instance where they can just play Mordred Tide. That's why Warmongers is so good against them, because you're making them use their resources while they're not playing Mordred Tide. Oftentimes, if you play Warmongers and they play War, yeah, they get to go Rindrager Swarm, trigger Malefic into swarming into their weapon, and they don't lose too much value, but they kind of are losing value because they would have gained more value if they had a Mordred Tide on that turn. But I really do think that Erase Face and Command and Conquer are not particularly good against this deck, so I would definitely play Warmongers more. I also think that Arsenaling Sync Blow is especially good in this deck because they are oftentimes trying to set up 5-card hands with Succumb to Temptation, and it can be extremely important to make sure to block out the turns where they can play it out. So you can set up in response to their setup by Arsenaling Sync Blow or another D-React. Dash.io is an interesting case because oftentimes if you attack them at certain points, they get super punished. If Dash.io is a 5-card hand and you attack with Command and Conquer, you are lowering the value of their hand, but if they don't have any items out, they're mostly happy to just block 6, maybe they play a Spark of Genius for Processor, pass the turn, they see what the top of their deck is, maybe they boost once, maybe they don't boost at all. If you see that they have multiple items out, then taking more cards out of their hand is extremely important, because High Octane gets much higher value when they have less cards in hand. So you can attack with Erase Face and CNC when they have a processor out, when they have a Tekla core out, and suddenly you're getting way more value. You can also just Arsenal Warmonger's Diplomacy against them, and then when they have a couple processors, then you just play Warmongers and get to blank their processors. Overall, even though this deck's a lot of 3 blocks, the value of their hand actually goes down significantly when you make them block. So unlike Viscerai, where he's just mostly happy to like block 6, play Read the Runes, or block 6, play Malefic, Dash.io is really not happy with blocking 6 and just like playing a Boom Grenade, because she lost a ton of value when she could be just looking at the top of her deck. Current new builds are actually very resilient to interaction. I think in the past, new decks were much more reliant on having 5-card hands because they needed to attack their opponent in multiple ways in order to prevent giant turns. But the CYB build is not required to do that. They can block with a bunch of cards and like play one interactive piece, and then they're just going to play CYB and gain their value later. So this deck is just really strong against interaction. But you can interact with them by playing Command and Conquer, because oftentimes the CYBs aren't going to block Command and Conquer. So if they draw too many cards that don't block, you can sometimes get them, and they oftentimes are arsenaling very specific pieces. Cards like Command and Conquer or Codex or Leave No Witnesses. I don't think you should be playing interaction into new. I think you should just play your game plan, and if you can outvalue her, you'll be fine. You don't need to make sure that she's not playing big hands. And I think that's it for the super meta-relevant heroes. If you have anything to say about maybe any of the other heroes on the list, maybe you disagree where I put them on this alignment chart, please sound off in the comments. I'd love to hear about it. Maybe your hero actually blocks really well in interaction and plays great 2-card hands. So let me know down in the comments and leave a like on the video.